Welcome to the book of Daniel. I'll be reading Daniel chapter 6, verses 10 through 28 from the Common English Bible. For some of you, this will be a familiar story. We teach the G-rated version of this in Sunday school. So I'm hoping that you're reading this book so that you're getting something deeper than the G-rated version of the stories that you think you're familiar with, because it might surprise you. There's a part in here that might surprise you if you haven't been reading along. So hear these words from Daniel chapter 6. When Daniel learned that the document had been signed, the document being, you can only pray to King Darius for 30 days, he went to his house. Now his upper room had open windows that faced Jerusalem. Daniel knelt down and prayed and praised his God 3 times that day, just like he always did. Just then these men, all gang together, came upon Daniel praying and seeking mercy from his God. They then went and talked to the king about the law. Your Majesty, didn't you sign a law that for 30 days any person who prays to any god or human being besides you, Your Majesty, would be thrown into a pit of lions? The king replied, the decision is absolutely firm in accordance with the law of Media and Persia, which cannot be annulled. So they said to the king, one of the Judean exiles, Daniel, has ignored you, Your Majesty, as well as the law you signed. He says his prayers 3 times a day. When the king heard this report, he was very unhappy. He decided to rescue Daniel and did everything he could do to save Daniel before the sun went down. But these men, all gang together, came and said to the king, you must realize, Your Majesty, that the law of Media and Persia, including every law and edict that the king has issued, cannot be changed. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and hurled him into the pit of lions. The king said to Daniel, your God, the one you serve so consistently, will rescue you. A single stone was brought and placed over the entrance to the pit. The king sealed it with his own ring and with those of his princes so that Daniel's situation couldn't be changed. The king then went home to his palace and fasted through the night. No pleasures were brought to him, and he couldn't sleep. At dawn, at the first sign of light, the king rose and rushed to the lion's pit. As he approached it, he called out to Daniel, worried, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, the one you serve so consistently, able to rescue you from the lions? Then Daniel answered the king, long live the king. My God sent his messenger who shut the lions' mouths. They haven't touched me because I was judged innocent before my God. I haven't done anything wrong to you either, Your Majesty. The king was thrilled. He commanded that Daniel be brought up out of the pit, and Daniel was lifted out. Not a scratch was found on him because he trusted in his God. Here's where the G rating ends. The king then ordered that the men who had accused Daniel be brought and thrown into the lion's pit, including their wives and children. They hadn't even reached the bottom of the pit before the lions overpowered them, crushing all their bones. We don't teach that in Sunday school, just so you know. Then King Darius wrote the following decree. To all the peoples, nations, and languages inhabiting the entire earth, I wish you much peace. I now issue this command. In every region of my kingdom, all people must fear and revere Daniel's God because he is the living God. God stands firm forever. His kingship is indestructible. God's rule will last until the end of time. He is rescuer and savior. God performs signs and miracles in heaven and on earth. Here's the proof. He rescued Daniel from the lion's power, and so Daniel was made prosperous during the rule of Darius and during the rule of Cyrus the Persian. Here ends the reading. Spirit of God, stir up your people. Thanks be to God. Daniel is one of the most challenging and convicting and in-depth stories of faithfulness that we have in the Old Testament, particularly during the period of exile. And so I thought it would be helpful if we kind of ran through the events of this short book because it's so filled with stories that we are familiar with. It begins with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah carried into the king's court because they're pretty. They're boys who are found without blemish, and so the king invites them to become some of his wise men. They're trained and they're allowed to go to school. Now, if you're like, who's Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? I can understand that. You know them better as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, which are their Babylonian names. As these boys are going through training, they want to keep close to kosher and Levitical laws, but because they're being offered food from the king's table, the king of Babylon isn't keeping kosher, and so they go to their guard and they say, "Sir, we would like to eat vegetables and drink water." And the guard is understandably apprehensive about this because he will be held accountable if they are not healthy and successful. And so Daniel says, "Give us 10 days. Give us vegetables and water for 10 days. You take our food, give us vegetables and water, and if at the end of 10 days we're sick, we'll renegotiate this deal." But at the end of the 10 days, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were found to be more healthy than those who had been eating from the king's table. So they were allowed to continue to keep kosher throughout their training. The next story we find out is that Daniel interprets a dream for Nebuchadnezzar. Not only does he interpret a dream that no one else can interpret, he's able to tell Nebuchadnezzar what his dream was in the first place because God spoke to him. Now, we're supposed to, as readers of this story, immediately think of Joseph, who rises to prominence in the foreign territory of Egypt because he could interpret dreams for Pharaoh. So Daniel is our new Joseph for the people living in exile. The king builds a statue, a golden statue. People are commanded to worship it. And then we have Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who refuse to bow down to this golden statue. And according to the law, if you don't bow down to this statue, you get thrown into a fiery furnace. And so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are pulled in front of the king, and they give one of the most incredible statements of faith. One that every time I read it, I cry because it's so overwhelming. They say, "O king, we know that our God can save us from this fire. But even if he will not save us, we would rather burn than worship this statue." And then you know the story. The king gets so ticked off at this that he makes the fire even hotter, and he throws Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire, and the fire is so hot that the guards who throw them in die. But then the king looks into the fire, and there are 4 people walking around. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fire with just their bonds broken. Their clothes and their hair is unscathed, and they don't even smell like smoke. And they tell King Nebuchadnezzar about the angel who came and protected them. Nebuchadnezzar has another dream that Daniel interprets, and Nebuchadnezzar this time is sent off into the wilderness, driven off by... It says he's going to act like a wild animal and eat grass like an oxen, and only the rain will give him a bath. And he spends some time out in the wilderness, and then he comes back restored to his mind when he's ready to acknowledge that God is the Most High God. Nebuchadnezzar's son becomes king, and he throws a party, and in the midst of the party, he asks for the holy vessels from Jerusalem to be brought out, and he and his wives and his concubines start drinking wine from them. And then this hand appears out of nowhere and writes in Hebrew on the wall. And none of the Chaldeans can read Hebrew until Daniel comes in and tells the king that this is an indication that he's about to die because he did this thing where he used the holy vessels to drink wine. Then the next king is King Darius, and we just read about Darius's decree. He gets talked into writing this decree that people can only pray to him for 30 days because it turns out that people are jealous of Daniel and they're trying to get him killed. This is an assassination attempt against a Jewish man that has power in the Persian court. And you read the experience of the lion's den. And then the rest of the book, chapters 7 through 12, is an apocalypse. It's an apocalyptic vision that Daniel has. Now, apocalyptic visions may not be what you think they are. At least we're suspicious of this. Apocalypses usually are written by people who are oppressed, people who have no power in their current situation. An apocalypse just means great revealing. It doesn't mean the end of the world. It means a great revealing, a great recreation. And so Daniel is a person that has very little, he has power in his situation, but we see that people keep trying to take it away. And he writes this poetry of the oppressed, which speaks of a time when the oppression shall cease, and the people who are oppressed will experience freedom. And it's written in poetic language so that the oppressors can't get offended by what they read. We're going to see this laid out really obviously when we get to the book of Revelation, which we're going to get to around Christmas, right? Merry Christmas, apocalypse. Sounds like a fun time to get there. But when you read the book of Revelation, there's a lot of like, oh, Babylon, right? Babylon, you're so bad. Well, they're actually talking about Rome, but they can't say Rome because if they say, oh, Rome, you're so bad, someone comes and kills them. But if they say, oh, Babylon, you're so bad, apparently the Romans weren't smart enough to put that together, that they were actually talking about the Romans. So, that's the type of imagery that we're talking about with the apocalypse. It's also the first time in the book of Daniel that we meet Michael and Gabriel by name. And they get the title of like, Michael is the Prince of Israel, right? And we find out that Michael is fighting a battle on behalf of Israel. And so we get this idea that there are angels conflicting with the gods of other nations, and it gets into a whole spiritual warfare. That's all in 12 chapters of Daniel. I encourage you to read it. But again, what's so amazing about this book is the faithfulness of Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They are trained up in the ways of the Babylon court, and they are given power in the ways of the Babylon court. They are given privilege in the ways of the Babylon court, and yet they remain consistent in their obedience to God's commands. This stands in direct opposition to why the people of Israel wound up in exile in the first place. We're told that the people of Israel wind up in exile in the first place because while they were in their own land, they chose to worship other gods, going so far as to sacrifice their own children to these other gods. And you put that in stark contrast to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who are in the Babylonian court, and they say, we can't do anything else but worship our God, even at the risk of our own lives. Now, I know that their faithfulness is rewarded by faithfulness from God. They're kept safe in extraordinary, miraculous circumstances. But more than that, because of their faithfulness and the faithfulness of God, they are given influence in this court. They are allowed to shape policy. There are even hints there that these kings who had worshiped other gods, these gods that were allegedly in charge of other lands, that these kings started to convert to their religion because of the men's faithfulness and God's faithfulness back to them. Now, when I think about faithfulness, the word that actually comes to mind is integrity. I don't know how you define integrity, but the way I define integrity is being the same person no matter what context you find yourself in. If I'm a nice and kind person at home, then I'm a nice and kind person at work. My behavior is the same. And the other part of integrity is that if I state that I have a value, I value something, then you can see that in the way that I live my life. That is how I understand integrity. Now, I know there's also things like if I tell you I'm going to do something, then I follow through and I actually do that, right? That's having integrity. But I understand integrity as if I'm going to say that I believe something, then I'm going to live that way. Later on in the New Testament, we're going to come to the letter of James. And in the letter of James, James admonishes the follower of Jesus, and he says, faith without works is dead. Some of you have heard that verse if you've been hanging out around a church for a while. Faith without works is dead. That's integrity. You can say you believe in God until you're blue in the face, but if your life doesn't reflect your belief, do you actually have faith? Do you have integrity in your values that you claim to have? Even Jesus talks about it in his parable of the sheep and the goats. Right? He talks about it like, what did you do with this? You say you know me, but you didn't feed the poor. You didn't feed the hungry. You didn't give someone to drink. You didn't clothe the naked. You didn't set free those in jail. And he warns us about the dangers of there will be people who say, Lord, Lord, and Jesus will look at them and go, I don't know you. I don't know you, because they lacked integrity and faithfulness. Integrity and faithfulness to God means that people should be able to tell that we're Christian Monday through Saturday, not just when we show up at church on Sunday morning. That our beliefs in God should impact how we use our time, how we use the gifts that God has given us, the decisions that we make at work, even if they make us unpopular, the way that we spend our money should all be reflective of our faithfulness to God, should all be reflective of our Christian values of having integrity in how we practice. It's a little bit counterintuitive. It's so much easier to conform, isn't it? But we go back to Daniel and Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah. It would have been so easy for them to conform, so very easy for them to go along with the culture around them. It would have kept them safe. And not just safe, but it might have made them more wealthy, more powerful, right? When Daniel says no to praying to God or to praying just to Darius for 30 days, he risks losing his power and his influence, and instead he chooses his faithfulness, and Darius converts because of his faithfulness. We're called to do the same thing, to live our faith out in the world, so much so that our actions become a witness to those around us. Amen? Amen.